You fool! Warren is dead. Terror under Eridu, and Others, 5 Forgotten Weird Tales by Malcolm Ferguson. Terror under Eridu by Malcolm Ferguson. By all that is holy, I urge whoever reads these words, get out at once. Leave the temple of Epher. Do not delay. Take this writing with you and read it outside. Then you may return if so utterly, abjectly misguided. Stranger, a dying, doomed man urges you thus in a matter which transcends life or death, yours or mine. Go at once and only open these pages out of doors. I can only hope, stranger, that you have obeyed my injunction, and what I have to say reaches the outer world in time. Maybe it will reach the eyes of someone possessed of a genius great enough to help, for my distracted mind cannot. The floor of the front chamber of the Temple of Epher, I know now, is a sentient thing, its surface resembling a gigantic doorbell push-button, though involving no mere batteries and alarms. It is a part of a living creature. Mind-staggering, nightmarish thing. Oh, horror, horror beyond conjecture! By what madness could this be brought about that the lidded mouthfoot of a gastropod of unheard-of size be guardian for the inner chambers? It is the crowning horror. For when I won my way back just now to this front chamber, I thought marvelingly that I'd escaped, but my light showed the small outer doorway, even then being blocked by the oozing, sidewise canting rise of the floor, leaving me confined, a prey. For I will never return to the depths below the temple. Already the rising lid or operculum reveals the creature beneath. I thrust this with my notebook at the feet of Epher. Not alive will the snail thing engulf and consume me. Heed well the notebook. It matters. I no longer do. Samuel Wheelcraft Chard, 31 December, 1913. 35 years later, Major Geoffrey Lemperley, standing before the Temple of Epher, turned to Theodore P. Marsh, his co-leader of the Apthorpe Fund expedition, exploring the ruins of ancient Eridanus. Well, this is idiocy. Do you suppose this charred bozo was trying to throw a scare into us? And if so, why? He might be a nut, I suppose, or a practical joker. Apparently he either left after writing this or was done in by person or things unknown. Surely he never reported his discoveries, or the Institute would have them in its files. We may as well read his notebook while we're here. By the way, did you notice the floor? Yes, Ted. It was grey and all of a piece. Don't you remember I remarked on it? I couldn't see how it had been put together without fissures. Come to think of it, it did seem slightly resilient, like cartilage. Perhaps this charred fellow was already stirred up by something else, and suggestion readily became reality for him. Just one look at the statue of Epher might do it. Maybe, too, he knew more than we do. Nebo and Nergal and Marduk and Ninib I knew, but Epher no. How alien, primordial that statue seemed. How slimy were its basalt lines. But the notebook, Jeff. The Notebook of Samuel Wheelcraft Chard. Eridanus at last. Here in a waste of sands was once the seaport of the Euphrates. Eridanus that gave the river its bygone name, Eridu, and even the stellar river now swinging wide above my head. Eridanus of Chaldea, whose gods were great. Sub and Nod and the deathless Epher. How far from us were these spade-bearded men, richly living, richly accoutred, accounted magicians in the days of biblical Daniel. The sealing of their sorcery was reputedly ever perfect. A remarkable thing, for such secrets are ever blabbed about, as hard to confine as open groundwater. And that is why I came here, a one-man expedition, a Peer Gynt puzzling this problem. For I do believe that the Eridanian Chaldeans had a power of sorts, perhaps imperfect, capricious, set to do some things and not others, tricky, part deus and part machina. Before the Temple of Ephor is an old sand and wind-weathered sign in Arabic, invoking an injunction from Al-Quran not to meddle hereabouts. Taboo, bad medicine, verboten. How weird the temple looks in the starlight, long and lean, like a coffin on its side. The only doorway is in the front, no bigger than a house door, built low near the west corner. Was it for astronomical reasons that the Chaldeans faced their temples north, one wonders? Reminding me of the passageway that snakes sometimes make or find to winter in a coffin, having heard of a baker's dozen so found in my native New England. But these are chide-worthy, childish, morbid thoughts, and I don't want to add to my trepidations at tomorrow's exploration of the Temple of Ephor. Enough for yesterday and today, discovery of the temple, examining of the exterior, and clearing away a century or perhaps a millennium of sand from the blocked doorway, whose cornice alone appeared. Possibly something in the blind face, the odious decorations on the cornice and of the walls themselves had caused the unknown Arab to erect that sign. I'm taking this notebook, my pistol, plus a miner's headlight equipped with batteries mounted at my waist to last 48 hours of usage. I can imagine circumstances under which it would be damnably unpleasant to be without a light. Later. My God, what I've been through. Can the body be caught in the mind's nightmare, or could I become mad by passing through the doorway of the Temple of Ephor, caught in a madness new and strange to the set of my mind? You who read this must have penetrated to the statue of Ephor, and your flashlights limned its horrid ebon, obese form, seeing with but a dread foretaste the image of this slimy riser from some unguessed primordial fen. Yes, all about you is desert now, but underneath the Euphrates channel seeps, through a muddy cavern measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. A sea and a sea's edge alive with remnant creatures which remember other suns, and abide their coming again. Yet how fearful, dangerous, inimical to man is their abiding. None of this I knew when I gazed upon Ephor, wondering at the minds that had devised such a creature, a man-dinosaur I called him, combining the brutal power of Tyrannosaurus rex, a cranial capacity as big as man's, bigger even, being to proportion, plus the dark skin of an amphibian. The heavy, stubby tail confirmed my classification as an anomaly. Yet how could the Chaldeans have seen a dinosaur to base their absurdly imagined mutation upon? After about 20 minutes in the temple's main upper chamber, I descended the rock-encased stairway leading from Ephor's right. At a level 20 feet lower, I found myself in a room with 3 doorways, right, left, and straight ahead. I chose the one before me, and found myself in one room of at least several, proving to be a sort of museum, scarcely furnished. Here my miner's lamp singled out on pedestals 2 statuettes which looked African, and beyond them were strangely adapted scale models of simple machines, pumps, a lathe, hoists. Next a metronome and a crystal bowl. Last of all, an escapement wheel. Good Lord, my mind cried out. Such devices could not have been known in Eridanus. Then I thought of the African tribes which inhabited tombs, of hermit crabs occupying periwinkle shells, and of other creatures that preempted habitation already made. Under the present circumstances, this thought was thoroughly disturbing and repellent to me, full of implications I could not hope to grasp. And rising out of the perplexity, another. Why had this collection been put together? Was it a haphazard magpie gathering, or did it have a logical reason? Impossibly modern it was, yet so far wholly in keeping with the ancient scheme of the building. I went on from one room to another and found always more irregularly shaped rooms in all directions. I was becoming fearful that I might get lost, a fear accentuated by the total absence of light, other than that of my own miner's light, when I found a blank wall in front of me. This relieved me by limiting the area I might get lost in. I therefore explored the room to my right, continuing rather than retracing my way. This was empty to my glance. It, too, opened only on two sides, plus the third doorway in which I stood. The opening to my right was a descending staircase. Making mental note of the number and direction of rooms I'd traversed, I went toward the chamber ahead. It was totally filled with spidery filaments, centering around a 6-foot cocoon which was held suspended from the floor. Great heavens, was my mind playing tricks on me? Or was there a weaving creature there even then? I could not know, for the sudden confronting of the web and its overwhelmingly large cocoon so occupied me that a scuttled retreat of a creature the size of a human head overgrown with hair, such a figure could have existed either in my harassed imagination or in the reality of an uncertain miner's lamp. I don't know which is more nerve-wracking, a miner's headlamp or a handheld flashlight. The former looks where you do, and can't see from the corner of its round eye. The latter probes nervously with increasing rapidity, so that one soon is unable to tell what he has seen and what has deceived him, or yet looms darkly in his light's fitful progress. In turning from that fearful room, my light caught something I had not seen before. I don't know why I didn't faint. 4 men stood, leaning slightly against the wall. They were dressed in modern costume, though with different modifications, as if for climate, time of day, occupation, and so forth. Each stood with ghastly stiffness, and wore a card. A line of English amidst the hash of alien markings stood out as my miner's light leapt frantically from one to another. Ambrose Bierce, Rudolph Diesel, Albert Jewell, J. Wilberforce Martin. Editor's note. As Samuel W. Chard could not have known, each of these 4 prominent men were reported to have vanished from the face of the earth or from ocean-going steamers during the year 1913. And now, from the rooms which I had come, I could hear a measured tread. It was coming nearer. Crazily, I plunged down the staircase. Deeper. I fled down 2 flights in panic haste. Down below, I could hear the slow splash and slap of water. I stopped, turning like a trapped rat, my pistol in my hand. A single-celled room opened off the staircase. In it, incredibly, was a modern, freshly made bed, and on that bed's white-scented counterpane a freshly cut red rose. But as the steps continued on the staircase, I turned down once more. Had some other explorer tumbled on my trail, I wondered, my mind seeking the unlikely natural explanation. Desperate, determined, I refused to be driven further by the approaching footsteps, to be hustled ever deeper until I met other dangers, or at least the hazards of strange footing. On reaching the next level, I probed with my headlamp. I saw then that to stand and meet whoever or whatever approached was indeed my best chance. For ahead of me, at the end of a hallway, was a subterranean river's edge. A doorway led off to right and left, that on the left having the appearance, as I glanced hastily, frantically, seeking reassurance that my back would be protected from I knew not what, like a library. I pointed my drawn, cocked pistol at the stone staircase. My hand shook as I waited the long moment between sound and sight, realizing that my light would warn the newcomer, removing any advantage I might hope to seize. Sandals of antique mode appeared opposite my sights, followed by a chunky, gowned figure. But when at last the face came in view, my pistol fell from my shaking hands. The man was blind. Ordinarily, blindness evokes my sympathy. Yet coming here, it augured much of the fearful, of horror. The man was short, of a square, powerful build, with red hair. His skin was totally devoid of colour. I had drawn in my breath and held it now as he approached me. I turned silently, following him with eyes, pistol, and miner's light until he had passed within arm's reach of me, and had turned along a walk that followed the river's edge. It was like a mad dream come alive. Somehow I felt he would turn suddenly while I watched and seize me. Yet he had kept on. Blind he could be, and pale from a sojourn underground. Blind and pale and underground, too, are the dead, my mind thrust up at me, frenzied by the encounter. And the thought, once set in my mind, would not be still. But whether living or dead, or either neither, here was a component of a cult utterly alien to our race, and to all else on our planet. The bizarre museum, those immobile figures outside the web and cocoon-filled room, the very fit of these features to this labyrinthine structure which outdates recorded history, all point to a mad, mind-staggering scheme beyond our experience. It is hard to explain why I did not then run at once back up the stairs and through the terrible series of chambers to leave forever the Temple of Epher. Could you understand that I was afraid to? Flight is coupled in the mind with pursuit, and with panic, which increases the jeopardy. One imagines, and sometimes meets in flight, sudden assailings and encounters from right and left. What an unnatural thing a crumpled newspaper is to a horse. I had neither the strength nor the nerve left for such sudden encounters, though daring more, really barring panic surprise. But I will not explain what I did, I'll tell it. Reassuring myself with my cyclopean headlamp, I saw that the room was indeed a library, a polyglot affair, including bound books in languages in incomprehensible dislocation of time and reason. Some were in English, I tell you. The room appeared empty. I had noticed reflected light on the river to my left upstream, and from this conjectured that not all here were blind. I had been careful, after my initial probe, not to send my light beams out across the river. There being enough light to see by, I switched off my headlamp, got down on my hands and knees, and with my pistol in my right hand crept to the doorway leading to the river. This put my head at an unexpected level, gave me more solid footing, plus an instinctive reassurance, for I was trembling badly. Of course my back was vulnerable to attack if I had been detected. I was painfully aware. What I saw made me almost forget myself. A score of men, creatures rather, in the aspect of men, were standing, some holding torches. All except two were identical in build and in unnatural stiffness with the creature who had passed me. The other two were a man and a woman, he tall, black-bearded, handsome, in a modern suit of clothes, yet with a sort of fez, sandals, accoutrements. She but slightly shorter, beautiful in a daring dress of unconventional cut. Slowly, as I watched, the balance of a large water clock tipped, and the ascending beam struck a gong. The sound caused a stir in the air as a dozen pair of wings flapped. Bats, I thought. No, they were too large and had tails. Pterodactyls, I now believe. The bearded man began an incantation, standing on a raised dais, while she, on another, stood statuesque 10 feet away, encircling both in one ring were the torch-bearing automata, whose heads were now concealed by cowls. He addressed the river, pleading, acting out a drama that was incomprehensible yet wholly terrifying. Music began, wailing, whining, and rumbling, with a cadent pull to it, evocative, and with it she began to dance. Then I saw the head, and seeing it, the human figures shrank to insignificant cavorting and exhorting puppets. There, neck-deep in the murky water, was the head of Effa. Living! The shoulders emerged, and then the squat black torso on heavy, human-like legs. Rising from the muddy waters, he came and squatted in the place between the male and female idolaters, and there were whisperings, guttural ribaldries, lalling syllables, and profane-seeming phrase between the three, instructions of horrible import. Then I pointed my pistol at Effa and fired. A pistol is a poor thing at 60 feet, yet I think there was a start of brackish blood from the creature's side, as he stood toweringly erect, like a monstrous amphibian ape, raging. The three, and I too somehow, stood transfixed. But the male idolater, first to move, seized a torch and ran, not around the arc of shore towards me, but to a top-heavy spiret pillar, and to it applied the torch's heat while bawling directions, polyglot and profane. I turned on my headlamp and fled, empty smoking pistol in hand. The rest you know. My arrival upstairs to discover the ghastly animate upheaval of the floor. Surely the idolater's torch heat had touched a nerve, and the gastropod winced awake, aroused. I write this with my miner's lamp turned on, and my loaded pistol cocked in my left hand. I presume that the search for me was delayed by the urgency of appeasing and perhaps ministering to Effa, badly wounded or thoroughly angered at a suspected trap, dare I hope. Possibly added to this assumption that I, strange interloper, was one of the 4 figures outside the cocoon room come unpredictably to life, and would not know the way to the blocked exit. But this is conjecture, much remaining undiscovered in the vastness of this castle subterranea. I fling this notebook in the lap of the stone Effa, avoiding the engulfing maw of the gastropod, now fully open. Perhaps before I die I will shoot the idolater who has renounced and betrayed the human race. I can hear them below me now. Note by Jeffrey Lemperly, Major, U.S. Army. At the foot of the flight of stairs on the left and right are empty chambers. Straight ahead are stone blocks weighing perhaps a ton each, skillfully set in. Whether recently emplaced or part of the original solid foundation, we cannot say. The stones are of ancient quarrying, apparently. This limits the extent of the Temple of Effa, barring secret passages of such cunning contrivance that we haven't found them. While we brand this a fiction, we are sending it out with our reports by today's courier. We are photographing the statue of Effa and studying some of the friezes, which have novel aspects, but after that we will look for something more interesting, especially relating to Marduk or Nergal, Nebo or Ninib. The Polar Vortex. Among the effects of the late Leopold Lemming, multimillionaire turned scientist and dabbler, was a small battered old chest containing several hundred yards of wire, on which had been recorded sounds, and a 200-page transcript of an experiment. Lemming had made his money in real estate, which is quite another thing from science, and, in spite of his considerably advantageous investments in new scientific inventions, most people thought of Lemming as a shrewd businessman and only a dabbler in the sciences, or, as they put it, the pseudosciences. This opinion continued throughout the estate's auction at the appearance of such fantastic objects as rune-hilted swords, waxen images of notables, volumes of Paracelsus, the Book of the Dead, and Cotton Mather, all copiously annotated in a cryptic shorthand, with now and then a vehement objection bursting into English, as he disagreed with one or another of these. There were quite a number of these objects, some common, some very esoteric indeed, but all apparently appraised as to their validity. Then there were volumes on the sciences, astronomy, mathematics, physics predominantly, all bearing this code of the modern peeps, whose choice of objects was so strange. The most curious acquisition made from Lemming's effects, however, was the battered old chest, which contained the manuscript in English, the dictaphone wire, and a small sheaf of notes, which turned out to be the casebook of an experiment Lemming had made in connection with his observatory at the South Pole. These effects gave evidence of a shocking ruthlessness, blindly idolatrous to the acquisition of scientific knowledge, revealing a curiously terrible experiment which could be pieced together from the notebook Lemming used and the wire reel. The Casebook of Daniel Imbrifer. 1st of February. I'm opening this notebook with high hopes. I think Daniel Imbrifer will be an excellent subject. Clerk by day, student by night, he strives with the valor of Prometheus. He'll do. And now, 2 years to the day since I laid the cornerstone of the glass-domed observatory at the South Magnetic Pole, I've met him in a bookstore, vastly hungering for knowledge, and for as much as he could not buy both books and food. Just under 6 foot tall, raven-haired, that he was a fathomer of dark pools was reflected in his eyes. I hope to plumb the depths of those pools and stir them into a mad wrath that spews up the long-hidden debris of their deepest abysms. I want to whip up such a tidal frenzy in his mind that all surface craft will be lost, and derelict thoughts be riven from their mud-moored deeps. But not a bit of this eagerness could be seen in my casual introduction, as we both groped for the same book. In a moment he knew me from various news photos and articles. We talked, I feigning interest in several odd volumes, he unfolding forthright views on science and myth alike under my discreet probings, proving with every word to be the man I wanted for my experiment. A noble mind, full of youthful energy, impatient to storm the gates of wisdom. 17th of March. Imbrifer and I sat late in my library, and over the third highball I showed him the model of my Antarctic planetarium. I had mentioned it often. Now I was ready. I explained to him that there was to be a council of scientists there, and cunningly interwove names known to him and names known only to my mind. I spoke with regret of my unsuccessful attempts to get someone who could represent the layman, since all these men had pursued their theory so long that they were blind to all others. A good pupil demands clear expression from his teacher, and often finds the weak places in an exposition, I argued. With such a student, we could inaugurate a series of round-table discussions, of seminars, of papers and paper chases. How could he be anything but impressed by this, and by the model of the sheer glass, double-thick hemisphere, in the deserted waste of the Antarctic, whose winter is a perpetual night? I dissembled the model and showed him the subterrane dynamo, the storage passageways, enough devices to ensure the safety of a dozen men for a year at least. I showed him the telescope alongside the observatory, which, even in the model, could be raised cunningly from its garage just as coastal guns are brought into place. And Imbrifer saw that the telescope could fathom the skies, recording on the deep screen before him what it probed, as if on an oversized television screen. It's a delicate machine, yet especially made to withstand cold, with the advantage that in the winter nights of the South Polar region there are a minimum of deflecting heat waves. Imbrifer took it all in, and I've taken him in. He's hooked. I've yet to get him to take the custodianship of the place until the conference starts. Say a month from the time we leave him there, flying away, his eye fixed as a cyclops is on the sky. I have yet to explain to him the apparatus for projecting an artificial skyscraper in cloudy weather. Perhaps I'll leave that until he gets there. But he's a prober, all concerned for the science of the thing, lured to look at the fascinating, and away from my magic-making skullduggery, teasing his mind to reveal its secrets, catching himself in superstitions and intimations of mortality, and then perplexing himself with why.
anon playing cat and mouse with a whim, letting it go and catching it again. 29th of March. It is agreed. Daniel Imbrifer will fly with me on the 14th of next month. I promised him the crop's cream of scientists, and so regaled him. He's to represent every man, or his equivalent in the inquiring man of today, at this intellectual Olympiad. While most of this is secret, I have had his picture taken as assisting me in research, and it's appearing in newspapers here and there. For 1 month, I told him yesterday, he is to be the sole caretaker at the Polar Observatory, relieving the 4 men now on duty there. He is to study the earth and the heavens, the vast deeps of space, and the tiny realm of man. I explained that as one goes to a foreign country to learn its language, here was his opportunity to study astronomy, to contemplate with all the resources of modern science the stars and the space between the stars. But little does he realize, storming the gates of wisdom, that this may be too much, that like no other man on earth, this world will be too little with him. Of course, I've shown him that physically he will be quite safe. Physically, yes, as snug as a bug in a rug. Auxiliary heating equipment, an emergency dynamo, and an oil heating system if these should fail. A veritable anthill of tunnels, stocked with more food than such a student as he was used to, rayed out, dry, cool, and air-conditioned, into the ice and frozen earth below. 14th of April. At the South Pole. The giant plane landed on the rough ice outside, taxiing to within 100 yards of the polished dome, which had kept its perfect sheen under the combined protection of an oil which prevents blown ice particles from forming and piling up, an invisibly fine vein de-icing system raying throughout the sheer glass dome, and a judicious placing of the observatory at the bottom of a shallow bowl, which is perpetually scooped by the winds themselves, yet is shallow enough to give the observatory an excellent horizon. The 4 caretakers, on shift for a month, greeted us enthusiastically. I have to keep them as much out of Imbrifer's way as I can, and exert all care that they pack their books and cards and magazines and games, with which they pass the time and beat boredom back. I hit on the scheme of opposing such vain frivolities for my student friend with a sanctimonious air that was quite out of my character. 15th of April. At the South Pole. Or, to be technical, at the hypothetical magnetic South Pole, diametrically antipodal to the magnetic North Pole. Today I leave Daniel Imbrifer to his studies, to burn the midnight oil in the uninterrupted Antarctic night, and with problems as ponderable as the night is long. He and I checked the observatory's apparatus, its temperature kept evenly at a chilly 58.6 degrees Fahrenheit, its air conditioning functioning perfectly, preventing heat waves from piling up under the dome, but creating a steady, fountain-shaped current of air, and keeping sight of the stars undistorted. And below us purred this giant dynamo with a low, even pulsing, which was barely perceptible. The lighting in the dome has been cut down to 3 shielded stroboscopic lights. One casts a wan light over a study table, another at the head of the bed on a gooseneck to swing over the low bookshelf, the third by the apparatus for raising the telescope. This was the extent of the furniture under the dome, and the smooth, heavy steel floor has only the trapdoor leading to the underground plant in the center. Around this is a steel ring, flush with the floor, which will reveal its purpose to Imbrifer in a short while. I checked its mechanism, as delicate as a watch, and found that when heavy clouds obscure the heavens, the electric eye will release a jetty vapor to fill the empty airspace between the inner and outer layer of glass in the dome. The ring in the floor will become a band of light, projecting on the dome's vapid black an exact replica of the heavens, as they would have appeared as the earth turns. And just as readily, the cunning show gives way to the real one. Perhaps this device will ignite the powder train which will set fire to Imbrifer's brain, until he feels a tottery atlas indeed. This device I set in motion, and yet one more. The dictaphone, whose wires will start with every sound and stop with every silence, catching every stirring above the pounding of the pulses in the brain's turbine. So. Extracts from the Diary of Daniel Imbrifer. 16th of April. At 13:50 hours by my watch, Mr. Lemming and his 4 caretakers left, having instructed me thoroughly regarding the equipment I will need to use here. It is strange that there is no communication with the rest of the world, or any reception of news of any kind. I objected strongly when he started to take the radio out, but he flew into such a rage that I finally let him have his way. He has an outline study program prepared, with questions for me to ponder. Insolvable questions categorically stated about dwarf stars, variable stars, comets, nebulae, gravitational pulls, orbits, the origin of the Milky Way, and its present direction of movement. The bookcase contains a dozen books on astronomy, celestial navigation, and mathematics, plus a strange typescript volume containing a collection of folklore and mythology concerning man's contemplation of the heavens. Selections from Pliny, Max Muller, Sigmund Freud, Sir James Fraser, Oswald Spengler, Dean Swift, Fiona MacLeod, Andrew Lang, Novalis, and the literature of ancient Egypt and Arabia, all showing man's perplexed fascination with the night sky. But all my scrambling around is but the reflection of my loneliness, for immediately as the green castor and red pollux on the plane's wings grew dim against the less colourful stars, loneliness rushed to my heart and took possession of my marrow. This tiny toadstool at the earth's Ultima Thule was to be my place of vigil. Well, I must stick it out now. If all goes well, I can afford to try a few experiments of my own after all this. 18th of April. The sky being brilliant, I summoned the Sentinel telescope and swept the heavens, the stars crystal clear in the Antarctic cold. Those of higher magnitude delineated as suspended in space, but what caught my eye as I followed the majestic sweep of the Milky Way across the sky was a void, an empty well in the sky, a sudden break in the spate of stars. This hole or blind spot is remarkably situated to catch the eye, being near the zenith in the lower left quadrant of the Southern Cross. Find the Southern Cross, the cynosure of all navigators below the equator, and this void gapes before you. It is the coal sack, gaping utterly devoid of stars from this hemisphere's most conspicuous spot. 20th of April. My calendar and my watch tell me it is the 20th of April, but my irregular hours will soon trample down the barriers between the days, since there's no daylight and dark to distinguish them. I find myself pacing the even surface of the steel floor. I linger over my meals, but the whole eating process can't be protracted over 3/4 of an hour somehow. I now know what the dour-scorched caretaker meant when he got wind of the fact that I was to spend a month here alone. It shouldn't be, mon. A young lad like ye. It's nae good for you to be withouten a roof. You canna keep your skull's cap on withouten a roof. 'Tis agin nature and God. And with that he took 2 quarts of whiskey, and with finger to lips he hid them in amongst the canned food. A little later he was about to give me a pack of cards, but Mr. Lemming interfered. Mr. Lemming is a strange figure, commonplace enough in appearance, yet how he tramples beauty and life underfoot in his search for truth. Doesn't he realize that truth should be cut in chunks man can swallow? That science, unless devoted to the orientation of mankind to this world, rather than to the bedevilment of mankind for your own satisfaction and perhaps even knowledge, is a perversion. Mr. Lemming's damn-the-cost attitude is too big for this world. I thought today that I'd at last be able to turn my thoughts to earth, at least for long enough to get my breath. But I didn't count on the genius of Mr. Lemming, who produced an image of the heavens on the dome of the observatory. It's a clever thing, throwing every detail visible to the naked eye upon the glassed dome. I suppose he'd explain it as, for the guidance of the council. but I see it as an effort to sever my mental associations with the man-sized world and draw me out into the realms of space. How little I realized when I came here. Is it really my imagination? Or is Mr. Lemming trying to condition my thoughts? How? Why? I remember a puppet show in which a man suddenly appeared as a fearsome giant after I had become used to the deft, graciously proportioned Lilliputians. Thus our premises of thought are altered, yet we are always human beings, not titans, nor want to be. 22nd of April. I could not bring myself to write anything yesterday. I studied and made notes on the southern constellations, examining the double stars all wound up in each other's fate, the dwarf stars looking what their name implies under the terrific weight of their bodies. I could not help but imagine attributes for the various stars, a childish trick firmly rooted in the mind of man. 23rd of April. I'm still studying books on this world and this universe. I remember of a man studying the phenomenon of sleep for so long and so deeply that he inhibited himself from going to sleep. He murdered sleep and had to seek rest in a sanitarium. 24th of April. After writing the words above, I went to sleep readily enough, but awoke in sudden fright, somehow startled, perhaps by a cramped position. The first thing I saw was that baleful emptiness, the coal sack yawning like an ape's gape in the night, dark, in a world of dark. 25th of April. Tired. I had better not write. Brain fag. Sorry, Imbrifer, old boy, but the first person is not well. 26th of April. Today, I took one of the books and went downstairs, but the lighting is bad. I could feel the stars above me if I could not see them. It was worse, as if the fourth dimension were lurking to swallow me into thin air. I had better stand and fight like a man. If I am going to fear anything, I want to find it out before it finds me out. Apparently at this point, the noises transcribed on the wire do not reflect alarming aberrations. An inordinate amount of pacing back and forth restlessly, a good deal of talking to himself, though nothing as fascinating or understandable as the diary. Very little laughter, except for a sardonic chuckle. At one point, Imbrifer took to running around the observatory, but whether from nervousness or from a planned project to exercise cannot be known. 27th of April. Poking around in the below-surface regions, trying to consume as much time as possible making dinner, yet at the same time subconsciously speeding up and teasing myself with my bodings, when I found a covered disc in the center of the floor and set in front of the hatch ladder. I unscrewed the 2 screws that kept the cover in place and found a mariner's compass. I tripped the release on the compass, setting it in motion. The release somehow broke in doing so, but I soon overlooked this as I watched the strange action of the compass. It fluctuated, wobbled, and spun for a moment, and finally settled down to spin slowly but steadily. Deliberately and determinedly it set about to register all points north, around and round and round. I suppose it sounds natural, but it was a possibility I had never anticipated. Apparently set in the center of the building's foundation, it won't budge. It's the only compass here, too. Is this the reaction a compass should make when located as this one is? The Earth's axis seems very real to me, as if it ran directly through the center of this building. I wonder if a plum, suspended free, would swing round instead of back and forth. I wish there were enough space to try it. I've been sitting here musing for 3 hours now. Here is empirical evidence that I am the man in the mulberry bush, and all men grope around me. Here is interpolated the first of the recordings from the wire, following a mad crescendo of laughter. Laugh, damn you, laugh. It will steady your nerves. Oh, Now, let me think this thing through. Here I am, at the imaginary point around which this giant gyroscope whirls. This small compass is cogged to whirl about the same central point as does the Earth, but though concentric, it whirls faster, being somehow the center of a smaller circle. Only at this orbit is the spin registered, since everywhere else it's offline. Even a mile off, the distance absorbs the whirl, though the compass begins to act queerly. The laws of gravitation offset all centrifugal force. Well, they do here for that matter, but there's still all that extra whirl left. No, it can't be. Where is that whiskey the Scotchman left? Here, if I can reach it. I seem to be walking all right on this dizzying disc. If only that damned compass would stop acting like a weathercock in the center of a cyclone. Ah, here it is. Tell me why the stars do shine. Say, that's good. It's a long time since I sang that in church. Tell me why the stars do shine. Tell me why the ivy twines. Tell me why the sky's so blue. How about that ivy business? That's strange. North of the equator it spins counterclockwise, just like a cyclone. South of the equator the vine twines clockwise, just like the cyclone. At the equator the effect is most dissipated. No crises there. But at the center of this little O, this orb, it spirals to beat hell. And that, as Kipling would say if he had been drinking, is why we have no ivy at the poles. It's also why you don't see streamers around the South Pole come May Day. 28th of April. I awoke lying across my bed, feeling rotten, fully dressed. I am not a drinking man, and feel down at the edges. But perhaps it's a good thing. This place is getting me down. And I don't mean because it's down under here, either. That's a lot of imaginary nonsense. It is, truly enough, one of the poles, though, and like only one other point in the world, its antipode, its nadir, its opposite. I feel better now. Perhaps I can study again. 29th of April. Today I contemplated the space between the stars, looking first at our nearest neighbor, Alpha Centaurus, and then I found, with difficulty, the external galaxy in, or rather behind, the constellation of Centaurus. This is another Milky Way. This wee haze amounts to somewhere near as much as most of the rest of our horizon's view for size. From Alpha Centaurus, light is supposed to take 4 years and 4 months, dragging its heels at its usual speed in a vacuum getting around to us. 2nd of May. My precarious equilibrium has been maintained, largely by not asking myself too many questions, and by not thinking about anything. As I spun the telescope away from a variable star I was watching, stars of the Milky Way swam across my field of vision as so many motes. Many of them are larger than our sun, and several thousand light years away. And then the bottom dropped out, as it were, as if this were too much for this mechanical contraption. It registered nothing. Nothing. A blank black. I looked up. Yes, the stars still shone, but the telescope's field was a blank. Fearfully and with moist palms I turned the dial. A star appeared at the lower right corner. I spun the dial away, up and to the left. Another star appeared. Then the troop of the Milky Way, as if the celestial ballet had started afresh. I'm afraid I whimpered at this, and fell all a-tremble like a puppy. I had accidentally stumbled on the coal sack, and it had taken me unawares. There is something about that celestial blind spot that makes me want to cower in a corner. But this damned place is round. 3rd of May. My watch stopped when I slept. I can tell time roughly by the stars, but I might easily become confused and lose track of the days. Then I'd be afraid to reckon up, for fear I'd lose a day or a week, and have it here ahead of me. I wonder if my pulse stopped, or whether it was some baleful influence here. Last night a terrible dream wrought me. A vine twined quickly out of space and seized my head. I awoke, screaming, and right above me was the lurking pit out of which the spiral spun. It seemed ages that I cowered in bed, cursing my cowardice, afraid of reality, afraid of dream. 4th of May, I guess. Relief! Relief! Damn Lemming! Something he hadn't thought of. A straw for me to clutch at as I whirl in the center of this polar maelstrom. An earthly phenomenon. One he hadn't anticipated either. He who ruled out snow and the rushing balm of a frozen death from his little study of this poor student, Daniel Imbrifer. He who created the glassy image of the heavens to taunt me, who exposed me to the gaze of the deeps, to the hypnotic pull of this vastness of space, drawing me out as oil on water in an element equally foreign and fearsome. The phenomenon sheds more light rather than less. The aurora australis. This earthly phenomenon has helped me get my feet under myself, at least for long enough to learn that my mind is that of a poor earthling and should not seek to soar too far. In this assurance I have won, for though I lose my mind, I have really gained it. Life surges back, and the pulses pace for a moment more sedately. At first the aurora australis marched slowly in crackling white radiance, as if the atmosphere were raining manna. Then in colored energy, dancing from horizon to horizon, taking in its bounds at a boar's oil leap. Lord, once again to be an awestruck earthling and watch the hound of heaven, the leaping Loki, the frozen lightning, the shattered rainbow, energy snared and transformed by witchery, a Hyperborean aerial, an impersonalized nervousness which drives out my own. My pen flows evenly, swiftly, as this phenomenon continues, because when it dies down, my energy will begin to charge and leap up. Later. The aurora australis is gone, but my mind is still in the ways of men. Though alone on the night side of the world, I know the rest is there, that the sun greets most men the world around. That work and days go on, I know. That men work at the vast drop forges, at the antiquated ploughs, that they ogle the women and test their strength with other men at games, that they are often cruel, but that there will always and ultimately be beauty and a warming of the heart, and though many are killed, some will see light and humility. Later. Perhaps I can last out the month, though I doubt it. I am afraid to compute the time and date by celestial means. I am afraid that time has stood still, or perhaps has crept at snail's pace, as if the snail had started at the back of my skull-bone, and had not yet lumped up under my hair at the top of my head. But such thoughts spin into the abysms of madness. And yet even unafflicted people use mad concepts, though they no more realize than they do the fact the earth is spinning and time speeding with it, though they see that the sun rises and sets while I do not. This morning I awoke quietly, and kept a blanket over my head until I had my wits about me. Then boldly looked out at the sky sinking into infinity, suspended in infinity. I think I can stand it today, though. I tried to make a deck of cards, but fearing I would become superstitious as luck played tricks with me. I would have embodied luck as an unseen presence behind me, fearfully pointing the skeletal hand at a card. And there is enough behind me that I have to keep driving back mentally. Sometimes obsession rides my back like a twining corpse. I will choose my thoughts carefully today being determined as the period until I grow sufficiently tired to seek rest. I cast about me for something to do, to keep me occupied. In this calm moment I see that it is quite probable that Lemming did, wholly by design, planned to use me as his guinea pig. Since one man has willed that this be so, and since I cannot alter it, I will let this record continue as long as it will to express this emotional disbursement and end either when I'm rescued or as it will. From the wire dictaphone. I am alone on earth. Once there were Adam and Eve, and pinch me. Adam and Eve have gone off and left me here all alone. I make the world go round on course, on time. But what if I should fall asleep and it should stop, and the rest of the universe be spinning except the world? There's a good boy. Crank the spit. If I could only really tell why I turn this world around. It's all in your imagination, Danny. It's all in your imagination. Damn that blasphemous compass. I'll break it. That's what I'll do. I'll get something heavy and drop it on it. This chair will do. There, that's better, but... oh, it gapes like an empty socket. What have I done? Now the diary again. Later. Yesterday I broke the compass, but I solved nothing by that. It still goes around in my mind. I was childish, and I am just aggravating myself. I am sorry. It would be better if I left it undamaged. Then I could see that things are as they are and get a foothold on facts that are fast eluding me. The wire record again. Yes, stop whirling. That ape's hairy black arm grasping the world from that ebb and emptiness of the coal sack turned inside out. Stop spinning me swiveling. Too fast. The world grasped as seaweed clenches a clam, but whirling as the ape's arm spins it. Unkinking. No. Grasping hand, pressing palm, sweat, pulled. It's me you want. Wait. I'll stand at the nub's hub. I'll howl it down. Yeah! Notes of Mr. Leopold Lemming. The body of Daniel Imbrifer was found at the foot of his bed, his feet tangled in bedclothes, his skull broken on the steel floor. He had apparently set out to stand astride this mad world. I wonder. Fortunately, I entered first, well expecting such a discovery. The crew of the ship is quite different from the one which took me away 2.5 months ago. Both crews believe I left Imbrifer for only a week, though he anticipated a month's stay only, and no one knows the devices I have here, not all of them, or why. Now, before they come in, I will gather and put aside all the data on Imbrifer. Here comes the pilot. I'll be shocked at my discovery. Within 24 hours, we should leave here.
Croatan. I am being held in the case of the mysterious disappearance of my friend, John Saunders, whom I visited at the hospital of St. Anthony, outside Roanoke, Virginia. I will not be held long, because I am responsible neither for his disappearance from an escape-proof upper-story room, nor, for that matter, for the equally strange cause of his admission to that hospital room. For there are two mysteries, one inside the other. To begin with, it was a mystery why John Saunders lay sick, and that sick he, for the moment clairvoyant, should speak of matters he knew not, and hint gravely, in a voice not his own, of mysteries beyond his ken. I knew him well, having often visited his house and the nearby workshop from which emerged the painted tiles, the pottery ware, and more recently the glassware which made his reputation. I had watched these creations grow under the young man's deft hands,
I'd argued with him about the folk aspects of this work, or rather examined his knowledge upon the subject, being frequently surprised by the depth of interest and knowledge of the tall, blonde, boyish-looking young man. It was, in fact, only 2 days after I had left his house that I read the strange item in a Washington newspaper. There had been a fall of brown snow near Roanoke, a fall localized to a radius of about 4 miles. Brown snow. That was certainly odd, I thought, determining to call John up on the phone. No doubt he would go to the scene to study it. Surely he could identify the alien substance if anyone could. He answered the phone on his workshop extension. "Yes, I have some of the stuff under the microscope now," he replied to my query. "And it's like nothing else on Earth that I know of. The particles are apparently crystalline, though they change shape rapidly, their movements making them seem alive or imbued with a lifelike energy. I want to try some sort of spectroscopic examination on them next, though I don't know offhand how I'll go about it." Whether he made a spectroscopic examination of the particles or not, or the exact nature of his difficulties in doing so, I never asked him, nor would I have understood in detail if he told me. I had learned that this substance was mystifying John, and I felt that my curiosity didn't justify me in distracting him further at that moment. Then, too, I was quite busy in Washington, and heard nothing further until the newspapers announced 2 days later the sickness of John Saunders and 2 other men, a newspaper science editor and an amateur scientist, all associated, apparently, with the study of this brown snow. The next morning, a telegram arrived urging me to come to the hospital. I drove down early in the afternoon. Saunders, who had asked that it be sent, was apparently permitted to see me, though I marveled that he wasn't put in isolation, his ailment being of undetermined nature and origin, and quite possibly contagious. I am no scientist, so I wondered why Saunders had called me instead of one of his friends among recent tech graduates. He was lying down in bed, quite pale, but in no apparent discomfiture at the moment. "Well," he said, our greetings over, "it caught me with my guard down. I expected radioactive elements and found no danger there. But germs, I had no way of guessing, or of detecting them without risk if I had guessed. So I found myself suddenly coming down with a violent chill. I was barely able to summon help. But, that isn't why I called you. I've been experiencing something quite alien to myself. It is as if my sickness called forth some urgent message. Hell, I'm not psychic or anything like that, but there seems to be something rational and also pretty urgent to it. So, if I can let myself relax and let this thing unfold without tightening up on myself as I naturally would if I were alone, maybe we can find out if it really is anything. Just in case this is lucid and of any account, I want you to get it down in shorthand. There are pencils and paper, my friend. You will forgive me, I hope, if this is babbling insanity. I am sure that it will be a relief to me if there is nothing to it. It is for you, then, to copy and record, and it is for me to prepare the apparatus, plug in, as it were, the electricity, and adjust the phonograph, so that if a record is inserted, it will be transmitted. Very well. My mind focuses, as before, on a beech tree, with the word Croatan crudely carved on it with a hasp knife. I know something of this. Maybe you too are acquainted with the grim jest of fate, wherein the last survivor seeks to express the enigmatic end of his tribe by carving letters on a tree trunk before his end also comes. His word can serve only to point up the mystery. Let us hold to this mystery, which I recognize as the sign of doom of the lost colony at Roanoke, here in Virginia in 1587, under Sir Walter Raleigh's patent. Perhaps the matter of the mystery
will be thus. Surely we should know. For if it happens again, and well it might, there might be none left on the face of the earth to puzzle over the few hastily scribbled words of the last to be snatched up, and that would be ironic too. It would be the ultimate irony, deserving to outlast paper, beech bark, and even the slow-crumbling face of stone, a cryptic Croatan, or whatever the word would then be, unread in empty continents, one word nearer an explanation than the empty shells of New York, London, Paris, Moscow. Yes, we are on the trail. My hunch has hit it. We are on the low shores of Roanoke, in what was to be Virginia. John Saunders' voice changed somewhat at this point, being a little less polished, more rough and ready. I was busy transcribing, and could not notice it too closely. I continue, without the burden of quotation marks, the story that John Saunders dictated to me from the hospital bed. In the autumn of 1587, our party of 89 men, 17 women, 2 children, and the newborn Virginia Dare watched the ships of the Virginia Company put out to sea. Most of us stood by the shore until the ships had disappeared over the horizon. Then, just as the sails dropped from sight and we were turning back, tiny Virginia Dare commenced to cry, a piteously small noise against the vast expanse of sea and woods. For my part, I felt in that moment the loneliness and weight of work of the winter ahead more than at any other time before. We would indeed have our hands full until the return of the ships, due to arrive a year hence with good supplies and capable colonists to add to our numbers. It was as carpenter that my name went down on the register, Amos Martin, carpenter, and I was busy from dawn until dark, and sometimes by torchlight for even longer, working with axe and adze, saw and sledge completing the necessary buildings, amassing firewood, and building fishing vessels. Others, women as well as men, were busy hunting and trapping, and gathering such herbs and mushrooms as they could be sure of in a new world. Still others were out fishing. 4 of us, all bachelors, shared one log hut, with a stone chimney in whose fireplace we did our cooking, using a number of devices contrived by Ashur Dakin, the large, amiable, bearded blacksmith who slept on the balsam boughs of the bunk below me. At first, we were fortunate in that our work went well, and our health remained good. Nothing beyond comprehension had then assailed us, either from the vast width of water behind us, nor the unknown forest before us. Work was our friend against the natural uneasiness that was otherwise our portion, with winter approaching. Do you know the feeling of waiting that comes before a snowstorm? The air is arush with the countless tiny particles. One night was ominously like that. If only that night had brought nothing but snow with it. The next morning the sky was clear, and on the ground 6 inches of snow had fallen. It was a strange, brown snow, with particles of some sort in it. As we gathered in the clear air that morning, we asked one another whether this was the kind of snow to expect in the New World. I have reason to remember that snowstorm well, for from the time of its descent we were in the custody of unknown and baleful forces. Not that there was any marked change as we stood at the doors of our huts and surveyed the snow-covered ground, but during the day some of us felt uneasy. I know I did. 4 times I saw from the corner of my eye alien black blobs in rapid flight, waist-high, going 50 feet before I lost sight of them. That night began the epidemic of chills and fevers that put to bed an increasing number of us. We were thus burdened with the problem of keeping one well person in each hut to look after the others, and above all to keep the fires going. The first 2 weeks were terribly hard for sick and well alike. It was then that something occurred that
terrified me so that I could not decide whether my reason or my memory were affected. I went to the spring one evening, carrying 2 buckets and an axe to cut the ice, and the chance that it had frozen since the last man had chopped it. There I met a man whom I had never seen before. I gasped, "Who are you?" He replied, "Charles Swain." "What? You don't know me, Amos Martin?" I stammered something about being tired, so that I hardly knew myself. The man acted as if he understood, and passed off my original ignorance as a fault of overwork. I looked at him as I filled my buckets. He wore his clothes strangely, with an exactness as if they were costumes and alien to him. His face was strangely pale, and its lines and wrinkles had an unnaturalness to them, as if they had been erased by some shock and come back awry. He stood there, presumably waiting to fill 2 buckets of his own, though I'm sure I don't remember, for I was preoccupied by the unhuman strangeness in his pose and manner, which I could not understand, but could only ask myself, what in hell is so horribly wrong here? If you had been aboard the ships with fewer than 200 men, and then ashore with 89, as I had, you would know each of them by name so that you could call them off. That is exactly what I did. I counted as I walked back with my 2 full buckets, and I had 89 names without Charles Swain. And yet the man knew my name. He was surely no Indian. He acted as if he belonged, his errand at the spring being presumably as legitimate as my own. I told Ashur Dakin of my strange encounter. He knew of no such man either, by name or description. He thought, quite naturally, that I might be suffering from the unknown epidemic, a thought which I had conceived of, but rejected as unlikely, for I had not felt dizzy, nor as if the core of me were frozen, as all the others had. Were these things to be expected in the new world? Brown snow, a strange plague, the coming into being of a strange man, or his semblance? One would know if one were back in England. One would know indeed with fear, but who could say here, or where could one seek among writings? Perhaps the snows are often brown here, and mean nothing, or that one adapts oneself to the plague and can defy its hurtful humours. Perhaps. Then came the first of the plague deaths, coming in the cold night, and only after the moment of death's impact was it recalled that those who gathered in the night, and likewise those who in the morning interred the body in the sea, had seen a man whom they did not know among their number. There was then a belated alarm, and there was greater credence of my account of meeting Charles Swain. Some attempts were made to link the death with this man's appearance, though no headway could be made with this idea. During the next 5 days there were 7 deaths, and several times he who called himself Charles Swain was seen, though he avoided seizure largely by the unexpectedness of his appearance. Ashur Dakin saw him leaving one hut. Rufus Pinchbeck met him while hurrying to the Lisbries, where a woman had died. Once Alan Duncan came toward his cabin with an armful of firewood, and saw Charles Swain leaving. Duncan dropped the wood, and futilely hurled one stick after another at the departing figure, who leered like Silenus over his shoulder. And Duncan pursued him, though with no success. Returning, he found that one of his cabin mates had died, and the other 2, both sick men, were nowhere in sight. Yet the snow bore only the trace of Charles Swain's footprints, coming and going. After that, we went armed. Occasionally at first there was hope of help from Indians, those near us being friendly. But now they shunned us, and we saw them only extremely rarely, and then in apprehensive flight. Our meetings were desperate affairs, with far-fetched plans hazarded and rejected. It was at one of these, however, that the idea was considered that Charles Swain was not human, but something which had borrowed human form. Evil. The pestilence that walketh. Among us then was death, and yet more terrifyingly, disappearance, for there was no trace of the two men who had been plucked from the snowbound cabin. I talked with an older man, Walter Pinchbeck, an able husbandman, and something of a scholar who was stricken with the plague. What he said was not sense, I thought then, but I remembered it. I have dreams that terrify me in a way that no thought of death or aught else ever has. There is within me, I dream, a teeming host of tiny atomies, alive and aswim, that engineered this plague. Terrible behemoths, yet encompassed in each drop of my ichor. Their writhing is my torment. And these atomies in turn are but earthly projections of kindred life from far space. They are seeds, spawn, germans of space creatures, and I have seen them too, these space creatures, also alive and aswim, or afloat upheld in a vast, dense cloud of the brown particles which make the snow brown. Totally alien, they live within this cloud, not as we live on the earth, but suspended as in a sea, only a sea of dry particles. It is a fearful, blind world, and in my dream it was as if I went among ghosts. But most terrible of all were the creatures themselves. One came toward me, a huge tower of glossy leather, topped by numerous tentacles, which took the place of eyes and ears in that dense medium. Beyond the sense of feel, whatever senses and capacities this creature had must have been within itself, so that it could learn only by taking up smaller objects into the orifice at its top for examination, or by hitching itself with its flat base, clinging to any of the larger, lifeless objects, and somehow feeling and communicating with its kind. But of that I do not know, for it was then that my son woke me in a cold sweat. Shortly after this, Walter Pinchbeck, too, had vanished, and in the days that followed I thought of his unbelievable tale of atomies within him. Surely I had no such atomies within me, or of creatures haunting a cloud in the depths of space. Then, as time went on, I wasn't so sure in my disbelief. Perhaps a fever would make me feel, and then make me know things that I now doubted, and those things might some day be known to be so. Can anyone know the loneliness that was upon us? There were other deaths and disappearances, including as missing the two men who shared the hut with Ashur Dakin and myself. As Dakin and I committed a body to the waves, it seemed to me as if we had suddenly grown smaller against the vastness of the ocean and clear cold sky, with the solitary gull wheeling and crying overhead. We became moody. Each person wondered if the number of human faces he would live to see was becoming daily smaller. We ached for the old world, though I did hear conjectures that these strange times might somehow be affecting our homeland too. Then, late one afternoon, I returned to our hut. Inside the cabin was dark, coming in out of the snow. I saw a figure on the bench by the fire. I thought it was Ashur, and started to greet him, and then I saw with horror that it was not Ashur at all, but Charles Swain. Indescribable was my terror at that meeting, which by its absolute unexpectedness and the bold indifference of my adversary completely stunned me. I could only stand and gape, now noticing that Swain's neckcloth was missing, and the flesh of his throat showed signs of a rope's abrasion. "Well, Amos Martin, we meet again. Since this is obviously my doing, you must content yourself that you can do nothing about it, nothing but listen to your fate. For soon we from the great cloud and the outer marches of space will have taken those of your colony whom we have chosen. For your part, it is my grim jest that you be left alone after we have taken our desired number, for experimentation, allowing that some will be broken in death. We are obviously choosing your little colony for our experiments because it will give us a working supply of human beings who will not be missed. Why should we raise a hue and cry? As for you, Amos Martin, one human, more or less." By then, I had put down the sack I was carrying, and with a dart seized up one of Ashur's hammers and hurled it where I had last seen Charles Swain. Even before the hammer skittered futilely along the table, I saw that Charles Swain had gone. Mockingly, a pile of clothes were left. I ran. I hardly knew where, but at last I was tolling the bell in the community hall. When the men came, I gasped out my story, and we went up to my cabin. They listened with apparent belief and sympathy, I thought, and they saw the clothes on the floor as I had left them. But as time went on, and it was certain that Ashur too had vanished, and that 3 others had gone that same night, there was muttering against me, as if I were in league with this devilish Charles Swain and the unearthly forces. For I had been told that I was to live, and that they would die. But could not these people see that my fate promised no better than theirs? True, my chance of being rescued by the relief expedition would be the greatest, though somehow I felt the ships would never come in time. I knew that it would be diabolic to wait as the slash of fate cut all around. Once again our numbers were heavily cut. I did what I could along with the rest, but more than once the sick refused the cup which I held at their lips, and more than once I was warned off with threats. Some of the cooler-headed men of the colony came to see me, and they expressed concern that I was becoming more of an outcast in the eyes of their colleagues when another pair of hands was so earnestly needed. There was little they could do, they and I realized, understanding that despair was undermining reason. There were now barely 40 persons left in the colony, and all of them were men. And I could help no longer, for desperation had made many of the remaining men little better than beasts as concerned me. So I fretted and stirred impatiently, realizing that I was thought of as lurking here, a warlock scheming evil in my solitude, or possibly harboring the evil genius, Charles Swain. And then one night there was a clatter at my door, and young Pinchbeck burst in. "You'd better leave, Amos Martin. They're coming to hunt you down. Grab what you can and run. There, now I've told you. I better not be here when they come." Was it cowardice that made me set to work gathering up what I needed? I wondered at the time whether I should wait it out. However, I set about packing, impelled to flee, with the little I could gather quickly. I didn't know when they would attack the cabin, but believed I would have a good chance of taking my hastily gathered supplies and skirting camp to an inlet where I could get a rowboat. Believing I should put 10 miles between us, I chose as my destination an island we had called Croatan, for thus the Indians had named it. I found the boat all right, and had rowed 5 miles when I saw a glow from the camp that I believed was my cabin burning. What misguided souls, wasting their precious substance thus wrathfully and vainly. Now indeed, I reflected, they would surely think me a warlock for escaping them, and I would be outcast indeed. For the next week I was busy building a passable shelter, as well as hunting and fishing. My struggles to live were occupying me again, though I still fretted about the colony and longed to be with my fellow men again, deluded though they were. Now I made no attempt to hide. I had merely removed myself, feeling that I should not let my blood be shed too readily, and my axe blows rang freely. If anyone chose to kill me, they might do so, merely at the expense of search and contrivance. Finally, my yearning to be among men impelled me to return by boat to the mainland, and, afoot, to the edge of camp. I took up a number of positions and watched to see who remained alive. Watching all morning, I could count only 12 men, and allowing for those absent hunting or otherwise occupied, I felt their numbers had dwindled to 30. So I returned to my camp, cold, hungry, and in anguish at the lot of my fellow men. On the 6th day following, I was out hunting, and heard a shot nearby. I placed myself in a likely position, and soon saw it was young Pinchbeck. I hailed him. He was startled both at being hailed and at finding me still alive. He was extremely nervous and apprehensive in talking to me. Obviously, the mounting anxiety of the men was wearing him down, for I knew what a terrible thing the restlessness of a doomed group is. There are 24 of us alive now. Edgley drowned himself, and Thomas went mad and was killed. The plague seems to be over, and no one else dies from it. They just disappear. And some of those who remain are dangerous in their desperation, unwilling to work, drinking liquor when they find it, and brooding murder on anyone whom they fancy a Jonah. And then he begged me that he might stay with me, urging that it would be as if he had disappeared, and he would thus be saved from the fear-crazed men, for neither he nor I were of a humour that made for such madness. I accepted his offer. Maybe I was wrong, but I accepted. Thus to draw from the strength of the main body seemed sinfully wrong to me, yet I was grateful to have young Pinchbeck's company. And perhaps, I argued, he might somehow escape through this change of scene. For all this while I believed the hateful prophecy of Charles Swain, that I alone would linger alive. So we two lived apart for 3 weeks, as under our occasional observation the desperate colony dwindled more alarmingly. Then one evening, as we gathered wood for the fire, Pinchbeck, who was between me and the fire chopping at a log, dropped his axe and screamed, clawing at his shirt. Suddenly, he was no longer there, nor was there any use searching, for I knew that the earth no longer held him. That night I wept, and under the vast, clear, starlit sky I cried out at the terrible void. I don't know what I did. I was distraught. The air seemed to weigh heavily about me and yet be limitless, and I felt that ruthless, unearthly creatures observed my every move, seemingly touching and handling me as surely as if I were in some unimaginable marketplace. The depths of the air swallowed my screams, and I knew not whether the creatures heard me and mocked, or whether I went unheeded. The next morning, weakened in mind and body, as if only a spider web held me from the collapse of the one or the other, I went back to the colony. I drew my boat up on the beach. I walked up the path to the community hall. No one was in sight. I cried out. No one answered. I broke into a sprint and staggered from cabin to cabin, peering at empty interiors, calling in vain. And then I opened the 6th cabin door. On the floor was a man, white-haired, outstretched, writhing. I rushed forward and clasped him to my bosom, but the man to whom I opened my heart was hopelessly crazed, I saw. He whom I had known as Darius Malum, a 20-year-old youth, lay gibbering incoherently, his whitened hair and fumbling, useless hands a jest to me. I went no further in my search, but stayed, seated on a bench, watching the brain-broken creature on the floor. I knew that he was the last man. And as I sat there, face in hands, in utter despair, the voice of Charles Swain spoke from the idiot lips of the unheeding man on the floor. "So, you came back. You are now the witness and the listener, and this is as it chanced through our contriving. One mortal was to stay, we agreed, so that if none of the others were carried across successfully, we would come here instead, as I did, taking the form of Charles Swain from a hanged body which I plucked from an English gibbet.
You see, we who live within the great cloud, whose particles are like that which you saw in your brown snow, have not senses like yours, our mode of living being quite different. We have taken human beings to study their structures, that we can will adaptations in our own, or possibly take over the earth, after clearing it of its mortals and other uncongenial elements. Oh, there are various courses open to us, as long as we're careful. Thus we prudently leave alone the main body of mankind to pick this colony. You, however, I shall use for one more experiment." Then Darius Malum was again incoherent for a moment. But suddenly he gripped my ankle, stared straight at me, uttered my name, and was gone. Gone, and I alone remained. It is strange that the will carries on when the mind no longer can. I left that cabin and, going to a beech tree nearby, hastily carved the word Croatan on its bark with my hasp knife, hoping that men from the rescue ships would see it and come. And with faltering feet I left the colony for my island retreat, taking nothing with me, caring little what would come to pass. Numb. I remained there, my mind mercifully dulled so that I was quite beyond minding the solitude and existing through habit. Fortunately, winter was quite over, and living was easier, though my nerves made me a poor marksman, being afraid instead of eager to shoot when I heard a noise in the underbrush or sighted game. I avoided camp still, doing without its supplies, though realizing that in time I would have to return or add measurably to the burden and futility of my labor. I held out until late summer before I went back to the colony to fetch supplies, choosing a warm, sunlit morning for this unpleasant scavenging. I had drawn my boat up handily on the beach, and entering the nearest hut quickly chose an armful of necessary items. Thus laden, I turned. I had reached the doorway when I saw it. My God, but the horror I saw there, the vast, leathery horror, topped by a ring of tentacles, with a gaping orifice in the center of this top, a towering 20-foot height looming up scarcely twice its length from me. I clung to the sides of the doorframe, my knees refusing to support me. I must be mad, I told myself over and over. This thing cannot be. But it was there, twisting and posturing on its base, now towards me, now away. How I broke away, kicked clear my utensils, and swung shut the door, I will never know. I know only that I am inside, leaning against the door which I have barred. I hear strange noises outside, rubbings against the log walls, a weird, throaty humming, out of which wail strange syllables. And now, as I hastily shred up the blanket, the voice of Charles Swain comes clearly. "So now you have seen me as I am, and I have shown myself that I can appear visibly on this earth. Even as I am, I will still be, when one day the race of man is no more, and we have come. But now I have twisted my blanket rope, and made it fast to the rafter. But wait, I must prevent my body being used, as was that poor unfortunate's on the gallows back home. Yes, fire will do it, if anything will, if only time permits. There, a blaze now, another, now 2 more. Now a kick of the stool, and Roanoke is no more, and Croatan yields nothing either. But I can hold no longer, save in seeking death." Slowly, the figure of John Saunders on the hospital bed began to stir, the mind to come back into its own. Well, was it babbling idiocy that we heard? I nodded negatively. Do you think that it was an unconscious rationalization of my own of this virus-bringing brown snow? I don't think so, John. since it is hardly likely your mind would work out unaided a number of details. Consider, for instance, that the deaths yielded to the disappearances, which occurred to me later as likely if this cosmic cloud spawn were engaged in kidnapping the colonists. Their earlier attempts would be less likely to succeed than their later, naturally, and deaths would result. Then, too, the brown snow itself and your own sickness cannot be denied and remain to be explained. Yes, but we can hardly depend upon ourselves to come up with the correct solution to such phenomena out of hand. It's worth consideration, though. Imagination is often the father of invention, if we can allow, as here, that projection is part of it. Let us agree, then, to this story's validity, since it seems unlikely that a new virus could come from an earthly source thus late in the game of cataloguing, and more likely that it came from space. As to the possibilities of a cosmic cloud harboring a higher form of life, that is admittedly new to me. But if these things are so, we must begin to venture preventative steps. We have advantages. These cloud creatures are predisposed by their more limited senses to inductive reasoning, whereas we can use deductive reasoning more fully. We may be able to immunize ourselves, and I think we will find that projection of impulses to their cloud, if the cloud can be found in good time, as is likely, may be effective. I think that both electricity and fire may be inimical to them. John Saunders was going to add something, but stopped, his features suddenly contorted, galvanized, into an alarming rictus. And then it was that I made an error that may have proved fatal, for in a moment a voice from John Saunders said, urgently, "Open the window quickly, for heaven's sake!" And I turned to do so. Fool that I was! For in the moment that my back was turned, something materialized in that hospital room, seized up a water pitcher, and knocked me senseless. Something I dimly remember glimpsing from the corner of my eye before I went down, like the mummified figure of a man, head a-loll, and the dried flesh of his neck twisted and pulled awry, as if by a hangman's noose. When I recovered consciousness, John Saunders was gone, and I now realized that possession of his mind came just before his injunction about opening the window. There are forces loose in the world that must be controlled. I fear that the acute mind of my friend John Saunders will be sorely missed in time to come.
The House of Cards, a Thomas Chadwick story. Now this Madame Jumel was a dark lady, or at least she aspired to be, from the moment she cast off the name of Alice Lemming and appropriated the name once held by a friend of Aaron Burr. Thus Thomas Chadwick began the evening's discussion. We had just put in a strenuous day packing old man Parmalee down from Hanson Mountain, after he had spent the night in the woods up there with a broken leg, and I was glad to stay overnight with Chadwick, the Englishman, whose newly acquired ark of a house was plunged in the woods on the old, disused road over Tumble-Down Dick. So, with considerable relief at a search and rescue job well done, and the veteran woodsman Parmalee restored to safety, I could turn my attention with interest to the facts that were agitating the mind of my friend, and the hot rum toddy he provided. She owned this house, you know, and for a while in the 1880s and 90s took in boarders. She liked the pretense of being a woman of mystery, dealt in clairvoyance, ectoplasmic emanations, and all that. I don't think she fully realized her opportunities, however. Surely this ghastly old house alone, or that pack of tarot cards on the table, should be enough, in the hands of a capable spook artist to give her the prestige she desired. Chadwick was right. The old house was a monstrosity which would take a lot of altering. It had been built in the 1850s, when dark brown stain was in vogue for the woodwork, and hundreds of board feet of fretwork had supplanted the honest, simple lines of earlier craftsmanship. Undoubtedly, the shades had been drawn to protect the parlor furniture from fading, and antimacassars, cluttered corner whatnots, and decorated kerosene lamps under the guise of good taste overcrowded the room, making one feel shut in and ill at ease, creating an apprehension which is part of that insidious, intangible feeling, our sometime fear, of old houses. "Yes, I've seen pictures of the old gal," I ventured. "She had soot-black hair drawn back sharply in a way that didn't do her features justice, and it's also true that her features would have appeared to better advantage if she had known how to smile, and not kept her lips in a thin line. Those black dresses of hers were certainly severe, too, but didn't a rumpus about death and insanity go along with her?" "Right on the noggin, old boy," said Chadwick gleefully, making his knuckles crack by way of being excited. "These 2 folio volumes have been giving me a good deal on the matter." He held up 2 bound notebooks stuffed with papers and dust begrimed. "I was lightening up this front parlor woodwork when I noticed that the bottom shelf of the corner cupboard lifts out," he explained. "Lord, what a find! Does this make her out to have been a murderer?" "Well, yes and no. Let's reconstruct the whole affair with now and then a bit of help from these volumes. Then we can judge better." In the spring of 1882, when she fell heir to this place, the Tumble-Down Dick Road was used quite a lot more than it is now, even if the railroad from Boston was already drawing traffic around by Tavistock. For 2 years she lived here by herself, wrapped in her exclusive interests and sheltered by the funereal spruce trees that flanked the south and east faces of the house. In 1884 came financial troubles, brought on by the New York bank failings, apparently. She must have been hard hit, because in less than a year she was planning to take in boarders. Yes, boarders, profaning the temple of her house, laughing at her behind her back, running the curtains way up, disarraying the antimacassars, pulling her back from the spirit world to get coffee or toast, occupying the bathroom, and lounging about in her parlor. The unhappiness of reduced circumstances cast a pall of gloom about this dark lady, Madame Jumel. In spite of her sombre mien, exacting habits, burnt toast, and cold coffee, and above all in spite of the house itself, boarders came. The west room, with its view of the White Mountains, was more expensive, whereas the east room, over this room, her front parlor, was hemmed in by the trees, now providently gone. The upstairs bedroom must have been cold and moist and uninviting, bearing in itself all that was wrong, all that was outcast of soul about boarding houses. With the snuffing of the oil lamp, the room was engulfed by the darkness of a raven's wing, an ominous atmosphere with an implicit nevermore, or a Votan's warning of a black doom due, a heaviness which seemed to be awaiting that horrible apparition known in the language of my Scotch schoolmaster as the Boneless. One fall evening, Madame Jumel fetched a French-Canadian crone from Tavistock up to witness some spiritualistic manifestations. Tante Marie was the best audience Madame Jumel could get sometimes, though she often proved disappointing to her hostess. Madame Jumel might perform at a séance with the distraught airs of Lady Macbeth, to find afterwards that her guest was quite unruffled. "These are just spirit," she would nod. "I see them often. They tell me their troubles. Yes, yes. But what is that book with the black shadow over it?" Madame Jumel's diary would splutter at this, calling Tante Marie a superstitious old fool, illiterate and unappreciative, and much more in the same vein. True enough, Tante Marie did not have much book learning, but what she had learned from was folklore, instinct, and word of mouth. What puzzled and vexed Madame Jumel particularly was Tante Marie's belief that a book, A house or some other inanimate object could be a sinister talisman, more than that even, a potent force in itself. Here, let me read you a passage from her diary about this Tante Marie. Rode down today and picked up Tante Marie in Frenchtown. She had heard that I had a pack of tarot cards at the house and wanted to see them. I told her how I had bought them from a bookshop in Riversmouth, just after a sailor had brought them in. Stole them from a gypsy, huh? Well, maybe. They're real old, 16th century probably, and have 22 symbols of Atu, besides 56 other cards more or less like ours. During the ride, I couldn't seem to interest Tante Marie in my Ouija board contact at all. The cards were all that interested her. When we arrived at the house, however, she became quite uneasy. "It's full," she said. I couldn't imagine what she meant. "The house. It's full. You had better not practice tonight or any more here. Bad luck, death, blood. Too long you have practiced here already. Full, like sparks in a cat's fur. Soon it will be stronger than you." With her hawk's face, beady eyes, and sharp, cackling voice, Tante Marie set me on edge tonight. Finally, I persuaded her to stay long enough to see the cards, whose mere physical form conveyed a dark force to the old woman. The only boarder, Horace Tolliver, seemed to be interested in them also, and folded his newspaper as I brought them to the parlor table. He apparently came into some money somewhere along the line, but it doesn't seem to give him much pleasure now. He just seems to wander around like someone extra, like the Joker in a deck of cards maybe, separate and different. The three of us examined the cards, looking especially at the Atu, or symbols, death, temperance, the hermit, Pope Joan, Le Pendu, a dead man hanged by one leg and in chains, 22 in all. Tante Marie examined them all with misgivings at the portent she saw in them. "Choose the card of your destiny," I offered. "No," she replied. "Not yet, I guess. Besides, I don't like the feel of this house. No, it would choose, not me. That would be no good." Mr. Tolliver could not keep his curiosity back, and said, "Choose one for me, then, and tell me what it means." She gave him a sharp look, an examination with her eyes slitted. Knowing her, I suspected she didn't like something she saw in him. Many time it is better not to know, but you do not believe, so choose if you like. With a convulsive move, she thrust the deck toward him. He shuffled and drew the Wheel of Fortune. "Ha!" said Tante Marie. "You figure this one yourself. Didn't it turn once for you? It will turn once more against you." Mr. Tolliver wilted at this turn of affairs, and mumbled his thanks for the fortune-telling. Shortly afterward, he went up to bed. I rebuked Tante Marie for her bluntness. "But, Madame Jumel, the card does not lie, and I cannot hide fate." After that, I couldn't interest Tante Marie in a spiritual manifestation. She was too engrossed with Mr. Tolliver and the card he drew, or as she insisted, the house drew for him. So I drove her back earlier than usual. Chadwick closed the book and explained that the room over the parlor in which we sat was the room to which Mr. Horace Tolliver had retired, the room flanked with spruce trees, its darkness having a dense atmosphere enfolding one like the black fluid some sea creatures exude. With its brown-stained rococo woodwork, its overstuffed furniture, and its ponderous oak bed with a canopy, it gave one the shut-in feeling of the claustrophobe, as if the air were denser, darker, a malevolent, sentient thing in itself. It was about 3 in the morning when 2 shots rang through that chamber. Madame Jumel, in bathrobe, thrust at the door, and finally, in desperation, fetched an axe and, swinging wildly, battered down the door. In the room, a flickering oil lamp revealed Mr. Horace Tolliver sprawled on the floor with a bullet through his temple. The scene Chadwick described was immediate to me, being directly overhead. A lamp, possibly the same one, was our only source of light, and I needed only to take it in hand and climb the stairs to see the room as it was when the body was found. Chadwick's interior decorating had not yet reached the 2nd floor. The suicide left a note, a hasty, distracted scrawl that sheds all the light on the crime that we need. But what possessed Madame Jumel to put this note in her diary instead of surrendering it to the authorities, who were soon on the scene? Perhaps her character suggests an answer. The fascination of this all-revealing note was too great for her, at the expense of little or no incrimination to herself, for it was obviously a suicide. She could hold the key to the crying mystery of why. Silently, Chadwick handed me the loose sheets from the diary. Will it not end? This house, this room, this bed, that Canuck witch woman? What madness! Is there no peace after all these years? Never before has it been so bad, but now the whole crime is before me, around me. I came up to bed with that wheel of fortune on my mind, haunted by the fact that a wheel is round, and so is a well, and that my fortune began with a well. I was Miss Emily's handyman then, 20 years ago, a young fool covetous of her riches. Wasn't money all I needed to make Jeanette my wife? Doubly a fool for that. But tonight there is no sleep. In the deep dark of this room, dark enough to make one pale, lying in bed, a fearful sensation overcame me. I was spinning backwards and inwards down a long spiral darkness. I opened my eyes and sat up. I was sure the utterly black room was going round me. Had I eaten or drunk immoderately? Surely not. Never since my crime had I taken a drink. I haven't dared. Good God, I exclaimed softly, and the sound echoed back, I swear it, a mocking, hollow horror that could only have come from the depths of a well. Then all sensation of being in bed left me, and I felt myself bruised and numb, but strangely dry, in the bottom of a well. I reached out, sand, cobwebs, cold rock. At last a glimmer of light, a faint trace only. My hands gripped into the sand in spite of me. I was looking up from the dry bottom of a well, up the rough stones to the top, and the supreme horror there, leaning over and obscuring the light of day, was the old lady, Miss Emily, wet and dead, just as she was when her body was hauled out. I closed my eyes and thrust my hands before them. Could I not shut out this vision? I dared not stir and feel the sand, the cold stone. Slowly a spider crawled up my back, threading beads of sweat on the web it trailed. And then a voice, not from a well, but from the outside, the unrestricted open air, remote, far off. Did you win your girl with my money, Horace Tolliver? Why did I cry, no, no? Was it to hear my own voice echo back emptily down the round well side? Have my worldly goods brought you happiness, Horace Tolliver? My sobs echoed back. I could not contain them. Answer me. No, no, never. What horrors this night brings, forming, reforming, mocking. Miss Emily, said I, today I'm going to fix your well, clean it and stone it up. It's about time, she said. Come out and show me how you think it should be. And then I was holding her atilt over the coping by her scrawny black-stockinged ankles, and she was pleading for her life. Most of her money was in her mattress, and it would be mine, she squealed. It will indeed, I grated. She howled as she plunged head-first to splash in the waters below. Then silence and darkness, until at last the crazily twisted figure broke the waters. How did I get the bedroom floor under my feet, or find a match, or light this lamp? What is forcing me to write? I can see my pistol by my left hand. In a moment I will clutch it and turn around. I know that Miss Emily will be standing there. I know it. As I put down the paper, Chadwick remarked that Miss Emily must indeed have been waiting, since Tolliver's first bullet was embedded in the wainscot where he had turned and fired it. I could see for myself, if I chose, where the mark was. As you can imagine, Chadwick assured me Madame Jumel walked on eggs for a while, after Tolliver's death. Her views didn't seem to approach Tante Marie's appreciably, however, and her rationale of the Tolliver death was long and involved with spiritualistic abracadabra, influences of the zodiac, and much more in her cluttered diary. She did manage to get the big oak bed moved out of the room, and an iron bed put in its place, not a radical improvement, but a step in the right direction. Madame Jumel's business was quite brisk following the suicide. The notoriety seems to have helped rather than hindered. It was undoubtedly notoriety that brought flashy Milton Digby to the Maison Jumel. Digby looked more like a gambler than a banker, but could this be a rebuke to our too ready observations? That he was young, dapper, and a man of leisure with no tangible evidence of a bank's problems touching him at all was more apparent. Madame Jumel described him as a jaunty man with a wide, toothy smile, and suspected that Milton Digby was becoming enamored of her. The one other boarder, a deaf old lady, came in handy as a foil, Madame Jumel gleefully recalled in her diary. Whether all this was in the old girl's imagination, whether Digby was really smitten, or whether he had an ulterior motive was not then evident. But this was only the third day of his stay, and one paid by the week, so even the colour of his money was hidden. Tante Marie had come to the house several times since the suicide. The old woman had watched with polite patience a séance of Madame Jumel's, never really put out by the spirits that appeared, as if she were quite familiar, even bored, perhaps, with the whole crew. Madame Jumel would be annoyed at this for a while, until her mounting desire for an audience outweighed her annoyance, and Les Tompkins, who helped out around, hitched up Bessie, and once again she would fetch Tante Marie. This evening Tante Marie wanted to examine the tarot cards again, her fascination with Madame Jumel's strange books having been worn out in earlier visits. So, with some diffidence, Madame Jumel produced them. Their undeniable fascination was more than an excuse to bring Milton Digby to the spot. Neither woman gave any evidence of desiring his presence or hearing his remarks as Tante Marie examined the cards. The Chariot, L'Amoureux, Pope Joan, The Last Judgment, and all the rest. What could have made Madame Jumel ask him to take his choice? No sooner were the words out of her mouth than the back of her hand covered it. There were times when Madame Jumel puzzled herself. "I would be delighted to find fortune in your eyes," said Mr. Digby with alacrity. "Nothing for it but to fan out the 56 regular tarot cards plus the 22 Atu." Mr. Digby promptly selected a card. It was the Juggler. "Ha! Le Battleur!" the crone cackled. "What accounts for this, Mr. Banker?" "Why, I must be the victim of fate's jugglery," he stammered lamely, looking at the card which gave him the lie, for on it appeared a Pierre blandly accepting accolades for his jugglery well done. A strange consternation had caught up with Digby, and there was nothing to do but withdraw and gather his forces. He had taken the room upstairs in which Tolliver had died. Judging from the long pause between the thud of the first shoe and its mate overhead, Digby was thinking, harder than he would like to have it appear. At about 2 a.m, Madame Jumel awoke to hear screams and the sound of Digby thrashing violently. "You can't take it back," he screamed, and the bed was shaken violently. "It's mine now. Don't think for a minute this cage is going to hold me. You—" What was Madame Jumel to do? Was this an ordinary nightmare? If so, how could she deal with it? "Drop that, Stevens. Drop it, I say. If you don't, I'll break open a bank scandal that'll make headlines up and down the West Coast. It's mine. Mine. Every cent of it." And he began sobbing and shaking the bed again. "Mr. Digby, do you hear me? Mr. Digby, are you all right? Nothing's going to hurt you. You're safe, among friends," Madame Jumel called, rattling the doorknob with both hands as her boarder became wilder, more distraught. Surely he could no longer be dragged by a nightmare. Suppose he were awake? And she fell to shaking the doorknob again. There was a moment's silence. Then the voice began again in a lower register. $25,000 and all mine. A little lesson in honesty doesn't pay, Mr. Stevens. Nice of you to lend me the money. I've been in that teller's cage long enough. There's more money in being silent than being a teller, Mr. Bank President Stevens? His laughter became madder by the minute. This had been going on for nearly an hour, when Madame Jumel dressed and went for help. At 5 o'clock, 2 husky neighbours burst in the bedroom door and found Digby unconscious, gripping the iron bars at the foot of his bed. Pale, dishevelled, and in a cold sweat, he was taken off to the hospital, strapped in a blanket lest he became violent. At the hospital, where he remained delirious, an effort was made to find his next of kin. With clues from his belongings and from his insane gibberings, it was soon established that 10 years previous he had been a bank teller in San Francisco, who had fled after the suicide of the bank president. The suicide note of the president, Mr. Stevens, confessed embezzlement and named Digby as a blackmailer. Barely enough money was found among Digby's belongings to pay for a week's board. He never recovered his sanity. Chadwick anticipated my question. No, Madame Jumel had not found any money among Digby's possessions, he felt, citing her diary's frank acknowledgment of a vain search. No, the money had probably ebbed away like sand in a glass, leaving Digby desperately hard up and a fugitive as well. For a while, Madame Jumel closed off her ill-fated bedroom, dropped Tante Marie from her friendship, and limited her spiritualistic explorations. She even intended to dispose of the tarot cards, but this was too much. Gradually she recovered her equanimity, however, and soon the room was opened again, and in it slept Mr. A. Morris Shumway, a retired realtor. But at least it cannot be said that Madame Jumel didn't warn him of the room's past. Mr. Shumway had the mouth of a guppy, making silent O's all the while Madame Jumel spoke. Before she had ended, indeed, he was off. Yes, Madame Jumel, I understand. I understand perfectly. After my own bereavement, I cannot help but understand how these matters affect one. My wife, Madame Jumel, was lost to me just 4 years ago, in such a terrible manner that it has left me sensitive to all such misfortunes. Poor dear Elsie was burned to death at our cottage on Square Lake. One wouldn't have to be as self-centered as Madame Jumel was to look askance at this stout, bald man who burdened you with his sad story before the ink had dried on the guest book. No, anyone might fear lest these doleful details be told and retold until the last bill was paid. Nevertheless, painful though this story might become in repetition, Madame Jumel would listen eagerly to the first telling, since for her the slow pace of the funeral hack had all the fascination of the fast pace of the fire horses. We were up at the camp late in the fall that year. One Monday I got up early to walk to the station and take the train back to Boston. Less than 8 hours after I had left Larchborough Crossing, I received word at my office that our cottage had burned and Elsie in it. Naturally, I hastened to Square Lake as quickly as I could. The terrible news was true, however. Nothing remained of our cottage but the big stone chimney. Elsie had died before the Larchborough fire apparatus had even been hitched up. It was horrible. Madame Jumel expressed her sympathy, but was soon off to open the room and prepare it for occupancy. The first 3 nights of Mr. Shumway's occupancy were uneventful, though he complained of sleeping poorly and of the room's stuffiness. But since he complained of everything else, with whinings and peevishness, all the while feeding himself on nerve pills, Madame Jumel didn't set much store by his more justifiable complaints. On the 4th day, Madame Jumel came into her parlour suddenly, to find Mr. Shumway examining her tarot cards. He looked up with a startled, rabbity expression. "Really, Mr. Shumway, I wish—" "Oh dear, I hope you don't mind, Madame Jumel," he expostulated. "I'm simply fascinated with these old cards." "You shouldn't get into my personal property, Mr. Shumway. You know that." He overlooked her remark completely. "I just chose a card, and really I don't know whether it's good or bad. It's the sun. Tell me, please, is that good, Madame Jumel?" "I couldn't tell you. Put those cards back where they belong." "Oh, very well. The sun does sound like a nice card, even if I've been terribly afraid of fire ever since my wife died. It was so horrible." This association of ideas between the fate of Shamway's wife and this card did not seem close to Madame Jumel. Could she have missed some important point of association that was in Shamway's mind, or did he always excite himself with far-fetched associations surrounding his wife's death? That evening, Shamway was quieter than usual, and retired early. Later that night, Madame Jumel awoke to hear once again noises from that fatal room. Shamway was coughing in a peculiar, half-choked fashion. Madame Jumel stirred angrily in her bed, and finally settled to listen to the latest boarder's discomfort. It was then that she heard Mr. Shamway's voice between coughs, a voice turned to a bleat with deathly fear. She arose and went to the battered, patched door of the guest chamber. First came a bout of coughs, then, "Oh, God! Smoke!" Then there was a long pause as the coughing died away. Madame Jumel was about to go back to bed when the voice of Shamway came again, abruptly, tensely. "Elsie, what are you doing? Why can't I move? Listen to me, Elsie, dear. You shouldn't tie me up like this, even for a joke. For the love of God, what are you pouring on my mattress? Kerosene? And that burning glass and those matches, what does it all mean? Come back, Elsie, come back. I'll never... Elsie!" Then he was silent. Madame Jumel listened, but nothing more could be heard. She went back to her room to turn over in her mind this strange nightmare that troubled her boarder. Finally, she fell asleep. The next forenoon, Shamway did not appear. There were 2 other boarders, both older women who had heard Shamway but didn't trouble themselves in the matter. Shortly after noon, Madame Jumel's anxiety became apparent. After calling a number of times at Shamway's door, she asked a young man who was fishing nearby and Tompkins, the neighbor who helped with the heavy work, to open the door. They quickly cracked open a panel and turned the key in the lock. Shamway lay stiffly in bed, with the front of his nightgown torn open. He was dead. His hands were convulsed about his bare throat. Dr. Sproul came, and hazarded the belief that death was due to a heart attack. The case puzzled him, however, and Madame Jumel heard, or thought she heard, him mutter something about symptomatter of asphyxiation to be looked into. This third misfortune was too much for the boarders, curious or otherwise, and Madame Jumel was soon forced to suspend her activities. Suspicions had been aroused, either by the doctor's indiscreet admission of strange misgivings, or by the 2 old ladies who would not spend another night in that terrible house. They whispered of having heard Madame Jumel tiptoe to Shamway's door the night he died. Was killed, they said. Since Madame Jumel had not been officially questioned on that subject, nor ventured to say she had been attracted to listen at Shamway's door, this sounded strongly against her in the old lady's whisperings. Much more was spoken, libellous and nearly so, hinting that Madame Jumel had engineered these misfortunes. Some thought for money, some thought out of an obsession. Only Tante Marie spoke out against this opinion. To her it was all brought about by that infernal house and by those diabolical cards. That was the way she saw it. Madame Jumel's diary does condemn her on one point, however. Here is the quotation. "All yesterday morning a ghastly suspicion was working in my mind that Mr. Shamway would be found dead. But I would have to wait before having the room opened. Not one word did I say of what I had heard him utter in the night, only that from my room I had heard him having a nightmare. At last the hour became sufficiently late for me to show alarm." Then Madame Jumel goes on to tell of the discovery. But listen to this. As soon as Tompkins left to fetch Dr. Sproul, I went into the room, ostensibly to cover the body, but instead I went straight to Shumway's luggage. In the bottom of his black bag I found 4 bundles of bills. Hastily I transferred them to an old shawl. Where could I hide them? The old stove flue, of course. Hastily I pulled off the metal cover, crammed the shawl and its contents onto the narrow brick ledge, and replaced the cover. And then, when the house was empty of guests, Madame Jumel retrieved the bills. Nearly $4,000 she had. No longer would she be troubled with boarders. Now she could live as she wished. At least that is what she thought. But with her boarders gone, there came to her a loneliness. She prowled about the house restlessly. Spiritualism seemed to her a mockery now. She wrote in her diary of all this, and of her desire to be rid of the tarot cards. She would burn them, in fact. But nothing came of it, until one night in midwinter she got out the tarot cards for the last time. With them before her, she renewed her resolution to destroy them, her pen fairly digging the pages of her diary in her determination. Again she wavered, and succumbed to a strange temptation. How did it come about? What quirk of the gambler's mind caused her to draw a card? At any rate, draw one she did. For later, when she was found dead in a snowdrift well down the unploughed road to Tavistock, crumpled in her frozen hand was a tarot card, the House of Destruction. Chadwick turned to look at me enigmatically. "Well, my friend, the hour is late. Would you rather sleep upstairs or down?" Mr. Hyde and Seek, a Thomas Chadwick story. From the way you describe it, Doctor, the Orne place does indeed sound as if it had a poltergeist bouncing around inside it. Thomas Chadwick reflected, turning the nutmeg grounds about in the tumbler in his gaunt, weather-stained hand. Which is, of course, more readily said than settled. For how does one cope with such a critter? Assuming that Eliza Blaine is host, or hostess rather, for this manifestation, should she and it be treated according to the concepts which the psychologists use when they so gingerly deal with such a phenomenon, or in terms of the specialists in psychic affairs? For my part, sir, if I were more deeply involved, I'd try neither, but record any phenomena in simple terms and try to settle in my own mind enough of their nature to warrant an attempt to break them up. Good, good. Now we can start from the beginning, with some idea what the term poltergeist means to you. Yes, sometimes strange supernormal happenings occur in the vicinity of an adolescent, which come to be attributed to the operation of an alien power, directing agent, elemental force, or what you will, upon his victim's personality. The picture is that of a hermit crab in the shell of a periwinkle, only here the same skull quarters are shared simultaneously by an alternately dominant and dormant power and victim. The psychologist is on a spot, since this setup would be duck soup for a Freudian explanation if it weren't for the recorded hell-raisings outside of the subject's accomplishments. Such unaccountable but recurrent pranks as a deluge of stones, strange peltings which explain the German name poltergeist, pelting ghost, and a variety of caprices worthy of a Puck or a kobold. I refilled Chadwick's glass and my own, taking the hot water with which to dilute the rum from a kettle in a chimney niche built a century back for this purpose. But the hell of it is, the symptoms are external to the subject, Chadwick argued, and the credibility of such evidence must be tested before we can establish a satisfactory attitude regarding the poltergeist. I was just agreeing with my elderly friend when a car's headlights swept Chadwick's window. "That's probably Oliver Orne now," I commented, going to the door. Orne was a strong, wiry man in his late 40s. He greeted Chadwick and explained that he had learned of my whereabouts from the switchboard operator, who habitually rerouted the calls of my practice at my request. "Mr. Chadwick and I were just talking about your ward's case. He has lived and worked in many parts of the world, and exercised common sense on plenty of problems which would stump a young country doctor like myself." Chadwick cut my eulogy with an epithet of mock contempt, and turned inquiringly to Orne. "Well, what I came for is this. Eliza went up to bed about 9, while my wife and I sat in the kitchen listening to the radio. Just after Eliza went upstairs, the radio began to static badly, so I turned it off. I went on reading the newspaper, but noticed that everything was real quiet, the sounds Eliza made getting ready for bed sounding miles away. Suddenly she screamed. Then we heard scraping noises ending in a loud crash. I ran upstairs as fast as I could, and found the kid fainted across her bed, with all the furniture drawn in a heap around her. The dresser, chairs, the heavy linen chest. I don't see how it happened." We sat quietly for a minute or so. Then he turned to me. "Dr. Huntley, I want you to come stay with us until we can find some way to stop these goings-on." "Why, I'd be glad to. Only I don't know about such things. Doctors don't— Perhaps we can find some psychologist," I stammered. "No, I don't want an outsider," Orne replied. "Maybe we can cook up some arrangement for you to stay at the house without arousing any suspicion. That would be best." After some discussion, I agreed to this arrangement, with the excuse that repairs to my house made boarding out easier for me. As I could promise no results, I made my fee low, and only chargeable if something favorable were achieved. So that evening I started a case daybook, carefully avoiding technical terms which would influence diagnosis. I give you herewith an abridged version of this case history, day by day. Disturbance at the Orne place. June 3rd, 1949. The homestead is a 2.5-story frame building with an L, a typical New England farmhouse. Built a century and a half ago, it appears to be in sound condition. The hand-hewn timbers, tenon and mortise and trunnel-fitted, the pine panelling throughout downstairs acknowledge this antiquity, and conceivably help provide whatever susceptibility may be needed for psychic manifestations. It is neither extremely isolated or otherwise, though it would appear so to a city dweller, for 75 yards separate it from the nearest neighbors. The location on the edge of Whitaker Intervale, against the wooded slopes of Dawn Mountain, would be agreeable, though lonely in winter when the sun goes down early in the afternoon. Anne Orne, Oliver's wife, is a small, energetic woman who does a great deal of work, though with all the stir of a wren in a dust bath. Oliver also is a worker, running his own extensive farm and hiring out with his tractor and other farm and lumbering machinery. Eliza Blaine is an attractive, well-bred girl of 15, with large brown eyes and brown hair. Judging by her voice and manners, she would appear to be of an even, genial disposition, without perceptible neurotic tendencies, surely. She had been adopted the summer before, following the death of her father, a distant relative of Mrs. Orne. Before coming to Whitaker Intervale, she had lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where her father had given her a number of benefits in education and upbringing. The first occurrence prior to my arrival at the Orne place was in April. Eliza had just bidden her foster parents good night at the door leading from the kitchen, which shuts off the back stairs and prevents draughts from dispelling the heat in winter. Oliver saw the door shut, and heard the girl's footsteps ascending the stairs. Then, half a beat behind them, another footstep started up. Eliza was nearly at the top of the stairs before Oliver gathered his wits and opened the door. She was alone there, turning to look down at him beneath the bare light bulb. Her face wore a strange, devilish smile, compounded of mockery, yet fearfully, terribly alien. Oliver stood dumbfounded, turning over in his mind whether Eliza had somehow prankishly skipped upstairs, but was unable to fit this deviltry with her character. So he ended up staring gape-jawed until she turned, snapping off the light, and proceeding in the dark to the next light switch just inside her room. When Oliver turned back into the kitchen, his wife looked up, nonplussed from her darning. Their discussion made no headway with the matter, partly perhaps since Oliver somehow omitted telling his wife of Eliza's strange expression. They concluded that this might have been a freak of sound involving the wood frame of the old house, and called to mind reports of similar happenings. In the latter part of May, on a rainy afternoon, the minister, Mr. Brainerd, came to call. Mrs. Orne was in the kitchen frying doughnuts, while Eliza was washing clothes, using set tubs and a washing machine in the L, also connected to the kitchen by a door. Mrs. Orne naturally exclaimed regarding the condition of the house, her hair and dress, while Mr. Brainerd climbed from his car. Nevertheless, after shedding these flattering preliminaries of a parishional call, she had settled Mr. Brainerd, a young, easy-going fellow, over coffee, fresh doughnuts, and discreet gossip. He sat facing the open L door, where Eliza was continuing her work. His coffee cup was halfway to his lips, which were pursed with intent to retract if the liquid proved too hot, when a cake of soap floated through the air, coming from the L, and swinging in a near 90-degree arc to settle in the soap dish by the kitchen sink. That was one cup of coffee Mr. Brainerd did not drink. Several minutes later, when Mr. Brainerd and Anne Orne looked into the L, they found Eliza caught by nervous laughter, badly convulsed, apparently from the effort of her performance. Indeed, the two mystified witnesses had to put her on the front room couch and minister to her with damp cloths, smelling salts, or whatever they thought best. There was no trace of the diabolical about her expression then. On recovering, she claimed she knew nothing of the episode, being quite unable to explain her attack of hysteria. With this episode, the story took form and spread through the community. I was called in, though my examination brought nothing positive to light. For the record, the story that the doughnuts in the bowl on the kitchen table flew onto the coat hangers against the kitchen wall is the invention and whole cloth embroidery of some absent party, a village loafer probably, for both Mr. Brainerd and Anne Orne deny any such occurrence. June 6th, 1949. In return for a couple of weeks with a limited practice, I had to put in more time at the hospital. Evenings were more apt to be free, and so far I have managed to be on hand most evenings, though nothing has yet happened during my stay. This evening, the four of us were seated at the kitchen table reading, or in Eliza's case, writing a letter to a Portsmouth chum. A mouse had been scampering in the walls, though I had not been particularly conscious of it, until I happened to notice Eliza reflecting a moment over her letter. I could almost see her attention caught by the creature's slight scuttlings and squeakings. Perhaps a sudden muffling of the atmosphere was responsible, as if a focus of attention of some sort were being established. Then all at once, Eliza's face changed, taking on the wholly tense, preoccupied expression of a cat about to spring. A full, taut minute thus, and then she gave a slight forward thrust, just the shadow of a lunge, I would call it. From the wall a shrill, agonized mouse cry piped. The Ornes looked up in surprise at the blank wall and its hidden, strangely racked victim. Neither Eliza nor I turned a heeding head, I, of course, being concerned with her reaction. While I think I must yield my medical judgment and say she acted as one possessed, as if the person within her personality were supplanted, her mind being temporarily tenanted by a diabolical force. No, this poltergeist is no mere prankster's connivance. A moment following the mouse's last cry, soon reached in rapid diminuendo, Eliza thrust the very tip of her tongue briefly between her teeth, and in doing so seemed to be released to herself and regain her own personality. Seeing the three of us watching her, rather than the blank wall behind, which was a still mouse, she shook her head slightly. "Gosh, I must have dozed off. I feel awfully tired. I didn't snore, did I?" I assured her that she hadn't, that we were merely looking up because we thought we had heard a mouse in the wall. "Yes, I guess I must have heard him scampering around. Funny, you hear a noise like that and hardly realize it. Shortly after that, she retired for the night. June 7th, 1949. I've been thinking a good deal today about the human brain as an organ. Now, the heart is fairly plainly a pump. One can comprehend its function upon inspecting it, as in dissection, and so on with all the other organs. Their functions can be readily comprehended upon examination. But the mass of grey matter which comprises the brain cannot be thus comprehended as the source of thought process. One cannot see where or how this viscera-like mass permits one to pilot an airplane and carry on a conversation at the same time, or to cope with a novel problem such as the present one of conjecture concerning poltergeists. Since we cannot yet look into the brain and get very far by induction, all we know about it is what we feel and experience ourselves, or what we observe in others. Therefore, I conclude, if phenomenal accomplishments are directed by the brain, of which the brain's possessor is wholly unaware, the fact that these functions were directed by the brain would defy detection. Thus, for example, the recent experiments at Duke University with cards regarding mental telegraphy, or the age-old business of making a divining rod indicate the subterrene presence of water, these in the human brain, or the homing instinct in the pigeon's brain, suggest that certain functions of the brain may exceed anything we have yet ascertained. Putting it another way, if we say, I think, therefore I am, the I am cannot directly challenge or enlarge upon the I think. And if an unaccounted relationship between forces of the mind and external objects and conjecturably forces in the environment exists, there's simply no telling of it. June 11th, 1949. Whatever it is, it's getting stronger, growing like a malignant tumor. Each successful exercise of dominance over Eliza's mind increases the power of the next manifestation, which may be less capricious and not content with a mouse for a victim. That Eliza is possessed by a malevolent entity or grotesque preternatural schism of split personality, or whatever in hell it can be called, for it is surely spawned of hell, is apparent to me, whether my terms fit the textbooks or not. Eliza and I started the evening with a game of checkers. This would prove diverting, while keeping me posted on her mental state. She sat in the chair Reverend Brainerd had occupied, facing the L, the kitchen sink. This is from the chair occupant's left to right, a window into the area of front yard which might be called the L courtyard. We played across a corner of the full-sized table in order to reach the board readily. Her game was undistinguished and free from devious tricks or wild gambles. My own is orthodox, too. I'm merely noting the less artful nature of this girl of half my age. Her chance came in the third game to force me to sacrifice, if she could be reasonably sure of her calculations. As she concentrated on the alternate moves, I watched her, though in a moment she screened her brow with her hand, and I could no longer see her face. Suddenly the air became heavy. A stillness that almost seemed sound ensued, as if silent black wings beat down upon the air. The telephone went ting, not ringing, but ticking, as these country lines do in a thunderstorm. I looked up at the windows, wondering if a storm were coming, but could see only darkness. Then I saw a face pressed against the L courtyard window, a white face, wide-eyed in terror. It was the face of Eliza Blaine. Breaking my gaze from this onlookers, I turned in amazement to the girl across the checkerboard. Her face was utterly alien, an abominable satyr's mask, looking in cool, sardonic amusement at its counterpart's features pressed so fearfully against the window pane. I think that I did the right thing at last. I ran to the outer L door and threw it open upon the courtyard. Switching on the outdoor light, I saw the courtyard was empty, and the impress of no footprints were in the garden plot under the window. I turned back at once to find Oliver Orne just catching the fainting Eliza. I think I did right, I say, because if I had turned and slapped the face or shaken the shoulders of the creature across the checkerboard from me, there'd be danger of psychic trauma for Eliza, with negative results as far as the poltergeist went. June 12th, 1949. This morning I visited Chadwick, telling him what appears here. His advice to me was, "Your best bet is to find some action which will fit all the various theories about poltergeists, since you're concerned with sure counteraction rather than theorizing. You must apply this action when the poltergeist is dominant, and in such a way that Eliza is done neither bodily nor mental harm. You must surprise the poltergeist, confronting him as strongly as possible at the moment of his greatest aggression, and you must do so with something as opposite in all respects as possible." I agreed, and we concocted, rejected, and sorted over a number of possible plans. Finally, we hit upon 2 or 3 schemes which seem more substantial, if they can be worked out. I do not propose to report on them now, as they may never be tested. Since one of them involved the services of a skilled dental technician friend, I spent the rest of the day with him in the hospital laboratory. June 15th, 1949. Fortunately, no manifestations took place while I was completing a variety of preparations to cover as many contingencies as I could. Today I brought back the acrylic plastic candlestick which my dental technician had produced, using his false teeth manufacture thus divertedly. It was a curious piece, anything but artistic, with shapeless, top-heavy bulges. Remarking upon its amateurish appearance and saying that I could do better with more practice, I put the object on the mantel with my tobacco jar and smoking apparatus. Since it seemed highly improbable that the poltergeist would appear in the presence of any object which it knew to be inimical, I hoped that this candlestick would not appear so. It had been a hot day, with thunder showers likely to break the oppressively muggy air. Shortly after supper, I was standing up, filling my pipe, as is my custom. I was reaching for a wooden match from the wall receptacle, and idly looking into the mirror in front of me. My gaze rested on the image of Eliza, or what displaced it. The face was turned as she talked to Mrs. Orne, but the mirror reflected the abhorrent satyr's head, self-confident with the myriad abominations of hell itself. As I watched, Eliza, or this horror, saw me staring at the mirror and broke into a sardonian smile. I turned from the mirror to Eliza. Her features were nearly normal, though the alterations were even now taking place, as if challenging me for my looking-glass view. I was not idle either, for the time had come, and yet my mind continued turning over the matter of mirrors, the lore of the speculum of Mage Merlin, the devil's looking-glass of Dr. Lee, of catoptromancy and vampirism. I had picked up the candlestick, and advanced slowly, with a show of irresolution, to the stove. Doctors and acrobats, bullfighters and actors must have a sense of timing. It is often extremely important. Here the poltergeist must think me uncertain, or bent upon hurting Eliza, at which misdirected aim he could laugh, exult, and grow stronger. So I advanced to the store as the transformation, unabated, reached its completion. Mr. and Mrs. Orne sat still as I lifted the lid of the hot kettle. I had to trust them to heed my injunction not to stir. Then the lights went out. The electricity in this part of the country sometimes does cut out when there are thunderstorms, but this was too opportune to be chance. From Eliza's figure sprouted mushroom blobs of static light like St. Elmo's fires, shining yet not igniting, forming at the hem of her skirt, her waist, the nape of her neck, swamp fire of the fiend's finding. With the room thus weirdly illumined, the poltergeist held both hands aloft with palms taut and fingers radiating, outstretched to the area above my head. Shrilly, Eliza's strained vocal cords emitted the fiend's curses and evocations. All around me stones fell, yet I was unhurt. I drew from the kettle the acrylic plastic figure. The action of the boiling water had fulfilled our anticipations by invoking the peculiar properties of the candlestick's substances, reshaping it into the form of a crucifix. As I walked forward with the talisman upraised, the demoniac creature emitted a hell-rending cry, as if a bottomless pit gaped beneath him. His hands lowered spasmodically to clutch idiotically about his face. His features withered and writhed, revealed as the electricity came on again, when, presumably, the fiend's willpower dissolved its damning block. In a moment, the struggle was over. Eliza, released, collapsed into her chair, and but for my free hand would have fallen to the floor. June 15th, 1949. Chadwick explains the matter by calling the poltergeist a virulent mass, and the crucifix an all-healing antibiotic, which is an interesting way of putting it. Since the crucifix was dormant in the plastic, the acrylic being peculiar in that once fixed in the form of a crucifix, it could be provisionally altered to the rough shape of a candlestick until its memory was stirred by the boiling water. When it reverted to its fixed shape, it could form a perfect opposite to the poltergeist. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,